we've got some things we need to talk about, is my premise. So, because there is sort of an ironic move in studying whiteness, which might recenter whiteness, which is already one of the problems that we've seen in both race as a scholarship and race as lived. But I would suggest that this is a sort of new recentering of whiteness, which is to recenter it not in order to valorize it as the rational scientific understanding of the social or life world, but actually as the center of critique. So it is to recenter whiteness, but in this sort of new way that we might want to see whiteness as a point of critique and transformation. Okay, so that I want to focus on the ontological status of whiteness. In an essay I'm writing, I'm calling it paleontology, or if you say it quickly, it's paleontology. For example, it contains an apparatus for the precise rendering of whiteness's origin as a social category. Okay? And I'll distinguish later about whiteness, whites, and white bodies. Okay? So I'm going with the assumption here, along with Monique Wittig, who wrote that one is not born a woman. I would say that one is not born white, and I'll say more about that. Whiteness studies comes with certain interventions or racial strategies. There are two significant camps that I'm going to be talking about, which is white Reconstructionism and white abolitionism. Reconstructionists offer discourses and interventions as forms of social practice. Okay, so discourses as forms of social practice that transform whiteness, and therefore white people, into something other than an oppressive ideology and identity. Reconstruction suggests rehabilitating whiteness by re-signifying it through the creation of alternative discourse. So that's where you might get the phrase anti-racist whites. It projects hope onto whiteness by creating new racial subjects out of white people, which are not necessarily ensnared by racist logic. On the other hand, white abolitionism is guided by Roediger's famous phrase that whiteness is not only false and oppressive, it is nothing but false and oppressive. Now you might ask yourself, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm only false and oppressive if I'm white? Okay? So I'm distinguishing between things like whiteness, white people, and white bodies. So right off the bat, if whiteness is only false and oppressive, it's to be distinguished from white people. Okay? Because whiteness in this suggestion is an ideology. It's a position and a choice-making part of one's life. So to the extent that you don't have to be white to make your decisions out of whiteness. People of color talk about this all the time. We have names for them, etc., etc. So whiteness is an ideology, a perspective, a worldview, a decision-making process, i.e. whiteness is a choice. Okay? Now, it's not as easy as that. Whites usually choose whiteness, right? There's a preponderance here. But we may choose, it's not sort of determinist, the analysis, is that whites can make other choices in life that are not guided by whiteness. They could be guided by otherness. So in opposition to reconstructing whiteness, abolishing whiteness sees no redeeming aspects of whiteness, and as long as white people think that they are white, James Baldwin once opined that there is no hope for them. Okay? Now, neo-abolitionists argue that whiteness is the center of the race problem. As long as whites and whiteness exists, little racial progress will be made. In fact, Noel Ignatieff argues that multiculturalism, without the critical uptake of whiteness and general race theories that don't do this, and that accept the existence of races, are problematic for their naturalization of what are otherwise reified concepts. So to Ignatieff, races are not real in an objective and an ontological sense, and therefore whites, for example, are not real either. This is part of his and their intervention. He does not go so far as suggesting that white people do not exist, right? Which is a different point. Furthermore, the investment in whiteness, the wonderful phrase we get from George Lipsitz, is the strongest form of investment because it is the most privileged racial identification. And as long as whites invest in whiteness, the existence of the non-white races will also continue. So that's one premise of the study of whiteness, is that it is the strongest, most crucial form of racial investment. The colorblind era kind of disallows us to, in public spaces especially, to talk about race in sort of overt terms. And so whites are usually at the forefront of that because usually being called white is an uncomfortable place to be. And there's also benefits to making whites invisible. Now, the clarion call for abolitionists asks whites to disidentify with whiteness, leading to the eventual abolition of whiteness. I would also add, in the literature you might notice, and I added to this in The Souls of White Folk, that this abolition of whiteness wasn't exactly equated with the abolition of white people. But to my understanding, if you sort of undercut the category of whiteness, which the identity of white people depends on, you are, in effect, undercutting the concept of white people. And so my recent understanding is that to abolish whiteness is to abolish white people. Okay? Now that's different from white bodies, right? White bodies will still exist, but we will no longer consider them white people. I'll get into this a little more. But I'm trying to distinguish between whiteness, an ideology, white people, an identity, and white bodies, which is some kind of literal understanding there that then we graft the meaning of white people onto, right? But if you undercut whiteness as an ideology, one that a lot of the abolitionists suggest is parasitic, right? And it's an ideology that white people really depend on. But if we give white people an option out of that, and it's not just sort of words, right? It's sort of structural transformations, then what I'm suggesting is that it also signals the withering away of white people. If you can imagine, we didn't have white people anyway about, let's say, 600 years ago. So the suggestion by abolitionists is we made white people. So one is not born white by virtue of having a white body. One has to be taught to be white. And there are many signals both in our home and in our schools of how whites are taught as young children to be white. And usually that means in opposition to the non-white, usually black. Okay? So white, according to Ignatieff and people like Roediger, is kind of a very negative identity and negative signifier to the extent that it is only what it is not and what it tries to suppress and repress, which is the other. Okay. Now, it might seem strange to you that white folks may find this quite controversial to suggest not being white anymore. It's ironic and controversial because in a colorblind era, white folks already don't buy into their whiteness. So why would it be so unsettling to suggest to white folks that you not be white anymore when most white folks go through daily life assuming they're not white anyway? Right? Well, I suppose one answer to that is that white people know that they're white. Right? But we talk as if, and this includes people of color too sometimes, but we talk as if they don't know they're white. We talk about whites as being ignorant of race, okay? Not knowledgeable, not having grown up with the discourse in their home. Now this has certain problems about the innocence of whiteness, right? Because we also know just from personal experience that if a white person took a non-white person home as a date, everything changes, right? To bring home a friend who's non-white, everything changes. So in some, at least lived way, whites already know that they're white. And that may explain why there's sort of this defensive reaction towards abolishing whiteness and abolishing white people. Because there is an investment. Okay? So colorblindness isn't necessarily such a literal process of being blind to color. It's about feigning being blind to color. Because in a completely racialized globe, how do you not see race? Is the question here. How do you not see race? It's right in front of you. And we know during critical events in our lives that raceness of whites is put in front of them and they have to deal with it, such as interracial dating and marriage, some of the very most racialized events in our lives. Now, of course, white reconstructionists would argue with this disappearance of whiteness. Okay? They would rather recover it, and the disagreement falls within two domains, theory and viability. Okay? Theoretically, Reconstructionists do not agree with Roediger's maxim, right? That whiteness is only false and oppressive because there are many examples of whites, such as the first abolitionists, and including the neo-abolitionists, I would call them, who have fought against racism, Reconstructionists argue that whites can be remade, revisioned, and resignified, more importantly, and are not hopelessly and merely racist. Their search is for a re-articulated form of whiteness that reclaims its identity for racial justice. They acknowledge that whiteness is a privilege, but that whites can use this privilege for purposes of racial justice and therefore contribute to the remaking of whiteness that is not inherently oppressive and false. So it's about rehabilitating, resignifying, re-articulating, unthinking, remaking, etc. Reconstructing whiteness includes focusing on white historical figures, like in schools, who have fought and still fight against racial oppression. So one of the suggestions here is that white students need to see examples of white people in whiteness that was examples that are working against racism. Okay, that too often there's this kind of reductive notion in history textbooks, in the literature, that whites are inherently and hopelessly oppressive. But Reconstructionists also have a sort of viability question, which is they consider this strategy as more viable than arguing for the abolition of whiteness, a discourse that I already mentioned, that most whites will probably have a difficult time accepting. The discourse of white abolition will only lead to white defensiveness and retrenchment and does not represent much hope for even progressive or anti-racist whites. To the Reconstructionists, abolitionism is tantamount to promoting a certain self-hatred, shame, and guilt among whites. The question still remains, what to do with whiteness is my question for today. So some concepts that I'm already focusing on are whiteness, white people, white bodies. How do whites enter into a racial discourse, a racial struggle, and what is their place within it? Because that's what the whiteness studies folks are asking us. And I'm also going to implicate and ask you certain things, certain questions to think about, which is whiteness's relationship with capitalism, which I'm going to speak to as well. So these are Giroux's questions, right? Because he finds that our current understandings of whites and whiteness is a reductive understanding, an essentialist moment that reduces whites and whiteness to just merely oppressive. So he's asking us certain questions about complexifying the category. Okay? What subjectivities can we point to that already exist that can then project some hope onto whiteness and white folks? And one of those that's key to Kinchlow and Steinberg is this critical pedagogy of whiteness that is positive, proud, attractive, anti-racist, travels in and out of circles with confidence and empathy. So there's this real concern about what to do with our white students and white young people. And you might ask, what's this self-indulgence in whiteness studies that asks the questions of, forget about you, now let's talk about me. Now you can say that whites already travel in and out of various ethnic circles with confidence. I suppose that we already call that donning on the other, right? Wearing hip-hop, and that there's a sort of exoticization of the other that whites already enter into. So I suppose the key here is the empathy part. Okay? That would be the addition, but the other part with the confidence already kind of exists. For whites to buy into as white subjects, to enter the race struggles as whites, because a lot of how it comes across to Kinchlow and Steinberg is that whites have to forget their whiteness, and that they have to buy into blackness, they have to buy into alterity in order to sort of join the struggle. But they're looking for a space where whites can be white and enter the struggle as reformed or transformed whites. And part of that means really focusing on the complexity of whiteness rather than a reductive notion of it. That there are many ways to be white is the concept here. That whites are working class, middle class, even bourgeois. Whites are women, men, gay, lesbian, etc. And so this complexification then prevents us from sort of essentializing whites as only and hopelessly oppressive and racist, because they are at the matrix of relations of domination, but also can be on the receiving end due to multiple identities. Okay? So this is the search for the non-essentialized white. And there's the side of it that we need to talk about, which is the sort of practice and political viability of Reconstructionism that Tischler and Steinberg are talking about. Again, it's not very strategic to them to sort of confront whites about this white racist legacy. And to Giroux, it's much more important to focus on whiteness than white racism, for example, because then it avoids this kind of defensiveness about the legacy of racism. Okay? Now, you might want to question the idea that, you know, just because people feel defensive about something doesn't mean that it won't work. Right? Men are defensive about patriarchy. That doesn't mean that we don't attack it, right? And so that's the question here is, just because something offends or, you know, offends one's sensibility doesn't mean that it won't work or that it isn't the preferred route. So the question here is more practical or pragmatic, and I think the abolitionists will have something to say about this in a second. Okay? So it is hard to imagine that a mass movement of whites are going to buy into the notion that you abolish your whiteness. But that never suggested that anything important was going to be easy. Okay? So the abolitionists would like to take this up, and that's where I'm going to go next. So to the white abolitionists, race discussions and race scholarship have been dogged by sort of the absence of whiteness studies in it. So to them, and you know, that's Ignacio Roediger, etc., any race movement that doesn't involve or critically bring into the fold a study of whiteness is doomed in some way to fail. Because to them, the point of studying race is to ask questions about its privileged signifier, privileged position, etc., and that's where you go and attack it. And so their center is the notion of looking at whiteness and the white race. And that really butts up against a lot of traditional race theory, which was to focus on the experiences of people of color. And to them, the point is not to interpret whiteness. And this sounds like the old injunction or critique by Marx on a thesis on Feuerbach, which is that the point is not to interpret whiteness, but to abolish it. It sounds like the point is not to describe history, but to change it. Okay? So they're asking us to dissolve the white race. Okay? And they're asking whites particularly to ask certain questions about, is it worth it to be white anymore? Okay. Particularly Roediger is good at this because he is a labor historian. Ignacio is more kind of centrally race or whiteness scholar, but it's Roediger who asks questions about working class whites. What it is to the extent that you have the denigration of white working class folks, the suffering, the sort of lack of education, the lack of health programs for them, the lack of power, etc. He's concerned that a class struggle really isn't going to get the white working class to where they need to go. Because part of their contradiction is that they are racialized working class people. And so I think what Roediger is asking is about the contradiction of the white working class, which is that they're using race, their whiteness, as a way of coping with their denigrated material lives, right? Their low health rates, etc., sort of from health to wealth, right? And so he's asking white working class particularly to consider the racial struggle as they're out of the class struggle, or as they're, you know, getting out of that oppression. Because one of the contradictions they face is they're going to ride this white train even if it means living this denigrated life. Now, you and I may suggest that there's, you know, if you even things out, that there are public and psychological wages to being white, even if you're poor. That blacks and other people of color don't have those public and psychological wages. But he's actually looking at that intersection here of what maintains white working class oppression and what can get them out of it. Is this coping strategy of at least I'm white. And he's bringing that into question. Okay? So that the white working class sort of, let's say, Marxist or socialist struggle is bound up, inextricably bound up with the racial struggle. And as long as there is no sort of race discussion within the white working class movement, it is bound to fail, or at least is disingenuous. I like this. This was a speech by Divisive, actually at UC Berkeley at one point. Right? They're really challenging the Reconstructionists by this passage. Right? They're asking, is what you're saying merely a discursive strategy because we don't find any examples of positive iterations of whiteness? Now, you may ask yourself, wait a minute, there were abolitionists who were whites, there are people today, there are people in the civil rights movement who were whites. Now, I suppose the way they're making sense of it is that when whites go against racial oppression, they are undoing whiteness and arguably themselves. So not all decisions that whites make, going back to my original point earlier, not all decisions that whites make are within the whiteness as an ideology framework. Right? But when whites make their decisions, and people of color make their decisions, out of whiteness, the results are predictable. We have enslavement, genocide, discrimination, labor market discrimination, segregation. These are all the examples of whiteness that we know as suggested by Ignatia. And there is no example to the contrary. But when whites do make their decisions out of otherness, that's different to them. That's not just whiteness. That's concrete white people making concrete decisions. And those decisions aren't necessarily guided, again, by an ideology of whiteness. That's, I think, very important to point out. So that whiteness may be false and oppressive, but there's a space here where we can say that white people are not just false and oppressive. Okay, they can make certain decisions that are guided by something else. So that's a very good question to ask Reconstructionism, is what are the examples? Other than it would be nice, for whites to be anti-racist, it would be nice to re-articulate whiteness. They're asking, show us some examples of where whiteness has been a positive force, not white people. So I think what we can tease out of this is an overt attempt to theorize whiteness and white people that I think is helpful, to disaggregate them, right? And so that's why I'm coming up with this recent understanding that to abolish whiteness is to abolish white people. And that's very uncomfortable, perhaps, but it asks about our definitions of what race is and what racial justice might mean, okay? So again, Roediger is asking the same question here about this genuine class unity is not going to happen because within it are these cleavages of racial struggles and gender struggles that prevent class unity from sort of happening and prevents white working class folks from achieving their goal. Okay? So the upshot is race treason, okay? Which, as we saw from Kinchlow and Steinberg, is not what they are promoting. Okay? That what does this betrayal of one's family mean? In both the literal sense of a family and in a larger sense of big W, big F family. Okay? And so they're asking, what is it that whites currently do? How is it that you signify and signal, that is, your loyalty to the white nation? And they're asking that this be broken. Okay? And what did Baldwin mean when he said, as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you? Right? I think he's asking that whiteness and being white isn't sort of a given fact. If Fanon were still, he might talk about the fact of whiteness, but I think this is sort of a complication of that, which is the notion that because you think you're white, you're also acting according to those discourses of how you construct yourself as white and recognize others as white. So there's this kind of, sometimes we talk about people of color as having some kind of secret handshake. There's a kind of, and sometimes literally there is a handshake. But there's also a white handshake, I think, is what's being kind of metaphorized here, is that how whites kind of notice and signal to each other and sort of recognize each other as belonging to the white nation. So we can talk about white nationalism, because nationalism often gets talked about as something about people of color. But if there's any possessive investment that we have seen that's strongest, it's white nationalism as suggested by this. And they're asking you to commit treason to this nationalism. But as you commit treason to this nationalism, you are then claiming loyalty to humanity. Because one of the obstructions to a full human development for whites is this buying into the pursuit of the white whale. Okay? But that sits very uncomfortably for even liberal whites, because what does it mean to leave home? A lot of people of color know what that means, to leave home, and to sort of be between two places, as Du Bois called it, a double consciousness. And I'm not going so far as to suggest whites are going to have double consciousness now. It's a bit more complicated than that. But what does it mean to betray one's own group? But as you betray your group, you're becoming more loyal to the human family. That's what they're suggesting. So again, we go to that question I asked earlier, which is it worth it to be white anymore? Whites are confessing their confusion. Okay? Whether it's really worth the effort, to be white, we need to say that it's not worth it and that many of us do not want to do it. Exposing how whiteness is used to make whites settle. Again, that coping strategy. He's particularly talking about working class whites. I think he's not talking about whites in general settling. But it's poor whites who are settling for their hopelessness in politics and their misery in everyday life. Okay? So the question is, in light of that misery, is it worth it to be white anymore? White women also hang on to this whiteness to the extent that that contradicts their own ability to then form alliances with women of color. And as white women do suffer this, demeaning lifestyle, it's contradicted by their own racial loyalty to the white nation. And I think the same question could be posed to white women in different kinds of themes that we could pose, but is it also worth it for white women to be white anymore? So, I mean, they're committed, Ignatieff and Garvey are committed particularly to this notion that if given these options in a realistic way, whites would choose, I think what they're saying is the moral choice here. But it has to be in some ways convenient, because currently it's very inconvenient for whites to argue for abolition because of its contradictions. And what will whites be afterwards? We can perhaps talk about that in our discussion. What will it mean to be post-white? Okay? Which I think implicates a lot of other things we can talk about, such as what does it mean for the other? What does it mean for race? Right? If whiteness is the anchor of race, and we abolish whiteness, what does that mean for others, and what does that mean for a race formation, a racial organization of our society? So that, again, to pose the question, what does it mean for the conceptual death of whiteness and for the death of white people? Okay. A lot of you may read the post literature, the posties as I call them, and it's very common to talk about the death of the subject. What does it mean to talk about the death of the white subject? So, just to pose for our discussion, what does it mean to be after whiteness and after the quote-unquote race transformation or revolution? What will whites be? What will other people of color that is, what will we be? And what does that mean for sort of an educational process to bring children up for this possibility? It's not something that anybody here is posing is going to happen in a decade, but at least the possibility that we can talk about what would it mean to sort of pose the possibility of a post-race formation? Some people call it, for example, and to end with, a society beyond the color line. So, thanks, and I look forward to our discussion.